My name is Jonah Dearlove. I'm a NHS GP. I'm also CEO of Neurotech, and we design products. We develop products for a neurodiverse audience. We've done a lot of co-design in autism and also ADHD. And I'm going to talk about the challenges of sort of clinical practice as a doctor, how that leans into design and where it sort of comes into a little bit of tension as well. So I'm going to start off with a quote. We have been speaking to our patients recently. We're developing a new digital treatment for adults with ADHD. And we've been working with LION+MASON to do some work in interviewing a lot of patients. And this was one of the quotes from one of our patients, which I thought really encapsulated this tension between medicine and design. Our patient said, "I thought I was broken, but maybe I experience the world differently." And for me, this really lends itself to this whole issue with how we approach illness, disease, and a variety of different conditions, including sort of autism and ADHD, where actually it's not something that needs to be fixed in a traditional medical sense. It is a way that you experience the world, and there are ways that you can lean into that and design for that, rather than the contrary, which would be trying to essentially tailor the situation and condition people to behave in a more sort of neuronormative way. So just to introduce ourselves, I'm the CEO of Neurotech. I'm a practicing NHS GP. I practice down in Southeast London, and I co-founded the company with Mr. Luke Speller. We had previously done a lot of work in European research. This was before I was doctor. We also have our commercial director and our creative director, Emil Swain and Anna Tong. And we have a neurodiverse team working on our products at every level of design. So I founded this company. I had previously, as I say, I'd been working in research, mathematics, robotics. I was doing work designing swarms of robotic fish that would find pollution in ports around Europe. And things like that. And a lot of these products would just never end up getting to any users. They would end up on the shelf. They would involve lots of companies and universities from around Europe and just never go anywhere. So we founded the company to try and translate some of the sort of lessons we learned from working on all of those projects into creating things which would actually do some human good. And this started off, we did a lot of work initially in autism and now also ADHD and other conditions as well. So we designed a VR reading comprehension system for students, autistic students at secondary schools. That was in collaboration with the Education Authority in Northern Ireland. We worked with educational psychologists, with teachers, and of course with the students themselves, and sort of went through several iterations of design, feedback, validation. We also developed VR careers tools for an autistic audience. And that was really centered around the idea that experience or hypothetical experience was quite difficult. Autism is a very varied condition and everyone experiences it differently. But one of the things which was quite common was a difficulty in conceptualization. And so we wanted to be able to try and bridge that gap and show young people what different careers might actually involve on a day-to-day basis, because there was a big gap there that needed bridging. We've also more recently been doing work with Belfast Stories in Northern Ireland, and that was designing sort of augmented reality systems that would help children in Belfast to tell their own stories. So it's the idea that you can encourage people to understand, first of all, what a story is, what makes it interesting to other people, and have ways in which they could then tell their story augmented and have that captured for posterity. We're currently developing as I was saying, a digital treatment for adults with ADHD, and this is born out of my experience as a GP. So I refer people, adults, for assessment for ADHD. The local waiting time where I work, which is Southeast London, is 4 years and 8 months currently. And that's just for assessment. So people aren't starting treatment for some time after that. And it struck me that there weren't really any good resources for people who were awaiting diagnosis. And I wanted to see whether we could come up with something which would help people not who didn't have to wait for that diagnosis, but to help them with the symptoms that they were experiencing already, which was the whole reason that they had come forward to see their GP. And that's an ongoing piece of work that we're doing at the moment. We've been working with LION+MASON on sort of making it more human-centered in our design, and that's something I'll talk about in a little bit. So just a little bit about what it is to be a doctor and how that lends itself to help or hinder with design. So I've said a mixed blessing. And essentially what it is that your experience as a doctor and your interactions with patients are fundamentally different from the everyday experience of the individual. So as we go through our training, there's an emphasis on diagnosis, symptoms, and treatment. So you have to recognize that something's gone wrong, supposedly, and that's going to lead to problems, which are the symptoms, and that there's a way that we can treat those symptoms and help the individual. And it's, historically, this is, you're trying to get to a middle ground. You're trying to essentially normalize the situation. And there's a big shift over the last 10, 15 years, which particularly with the sort of field of neurodivergence, by which I mean mostly autism and ADHD, and the idea that some people's brains function differently, and that is something in many ways we can lean into. And we're not trying to change the person. We're trying to support them to essentially be themselves in the way that they want to be. The other thing I would mention is this whole idea of a 15-minute consultation. So as a doctor, patients come in, I'm sure all of you have been to see your GP. You usually have a thing that you want to talk about. You might have 5 things that you want to talk about, but assuming you've got one thing, you've come in and it's either going to be a diagnosis, something is happening, you've got some symptoms, you want to understand why, or it might be that you have a condition that's been diagnosed, say chronic pain or diabetes, and something has gone wrong with your treatment, or it's not being treated as well as we would hope, and therefore you're expecting something to change. And so you get into this sort of parceled experience where everything will happen within a short time frame, and there will be a change, and this process sort of colors your interaction. And in the field of mental health and also sort of neurodivergence and neurodevelopmental conditions, there isn't necessarily such a clean-cut interaction, as it were. So in the field of mental health, it may be that your anxiety or depression is very well controlled for some time, and then something happens, and then you get into a situation where you need additional support, and that might go on for weeks, months, years, and that's going to be the time that you seek help from your GP. And there may be other parties involved as well. But fundamentally, from the doctor's point of view, it means that we are seeing people who are either in crisis or for whom something is going wrong. And that doesn't really reflect the everyday experience of most people. So 95% of your life, you won't be at that point. You won't be having that interaction. And this colors my sort of, not only my view, but most doctors' experience of what do we think about when someone has a particular condition? What are we designing for? We're designing to manage symptoms, and actually we need to be designing to support their everyday life. And this is why I've said, the lived experience is often, and the world around the patient is sometimes lost. Beyond that, there's also a mentality that goes with medicine, which is that you go through years and years of training, and everything is, of course, as it should be, about patient safety. Now, fundamentally, this leads to a very cautious approach. So when I come to designing products, or when I come to designing software that we're using to support people, I'll always immediately jump to the worst possible thing that could happen, and I can focus on that irrationally at some time. And so, I have to recognize that and work with my colleagues, who thankfully aren't doctors, and to develop and allow sort of ideas to gestate and be elucidated without wanting to jump to the worst possible scenario. So I have to watch that in myself. And as I've said here, there's also a routine exposure to extremes of health. You see people when they're really unwell, either through mental health or physical health. And again, that colors your expectations of what people are experiencing the whole of the time. So just to go on to a few specifics of things that we have sort of learned through our experience of co-design with different groups. So we did a lot of work, as I said, in schools with young autistic students, and we were designing VR reading comprehension software for them. And some of the things that we found out, because it was an iterative design process, so we would develop our prototype, go to the students and the teachers, and then go away with their feedback. We changed everything a lot, including the sort of fundamental purpose of the software based on that feedback and what was going to be helpful for people. And some of the things we learned. So one of the things to understand with autism is that it has an impact on your sensory processing and has an impact on your social communication. And it can also have an impact on your adaptability, your sort of how you manage with a change in your circumstances that is unexpected, particularly. So on the sensory side, we found that that we had to be very careful with the dynamics of sound and lighting and the color palette. There are specific palettes that you can find very easily online as well, which are autism friendly, and those tend to be sort of softer colors with reduced contrast, and that's more acceptable to sort of students in this group. We also found that sudden scene changes was a big issue. So the idea that you're not knowing what's going to happen next. So we had to do specific signposting. So in VR, particularly where your whole world suddenly changes, we had to make it very clear that that was about to happen and where you were going to be and what was going to happen next. And also we needed to make sure we used short, clear, positive instructions. So using sort of negatives or anything that was ambiguous was a real barrier to use, and we wanted people to be able to use this software independently, particularly because in VR it's much harder to guide people through a process. So that was something that we found. We also found gender had a big impact. So the boys in our class were more interested in the technology for technology's sake, so they would be much more into the idea of using VR and trying it out, and were very keen to use it. With the girls that we worked with, there were a couple of barriers. One was there was more of a wanting to know sort of more about why they were going to use it, what were the benefits going to be, and this feeds into something I'll talk about later. But also there was a big social impact. So the setting became really important. If you were trying to use the VR in a classroom where other people weren't using VR, there was a concern that other people would be looking at you, and that was embarrassing, and that then became a big barrier to people even using the software at all. So it became important to look at the whole context of how the software was going to be used, have it in a specific setting where everyone is doing the same thing, and have time set aside for that. We also found that, and this harks back to some of the points that Andy was making earlier, that unscripted VR interactions were actually much more positive than we had expected. So the first piece of software we developed was at the end of this story, which you would read in VR, you got to make a sandwich in VR. And there wasn't really an end state. It was just that you would build a sandwich out of the pieces that were there, and you could interact with lots of objects around the room. And everyone just wanted to make a sandwich and feed it to the little dog in the corner of the room and then throw everything else around. And at first we sort of thought, gosh, should we have like an end state where it's clear that this is over and you move on? And actually we decided not to, because actually everyone really enjoyed that. And it became a motivating factor. So we actually introduced that to some of our other lessons so that they would know that at the end of the lesson, there would be an opportunity to interact in that way. And that became a strong motivator, which was fantastic. So turning to ADHD, just a little bit about what ADHD is. So there are three main subtypes of ADHD: inattentive, hyperactive / impulsive, and then combined. So inattentive is that you fundamentally have difficulty starting, organizing, and completing tasks. Hyperactive is what many of you may think of when you think of ADHD, which is that you feel the urge to stand up and move around. You might be impulsive, you might sort of interrupt others or speak and find it difficult to resist the urge to do so. And then there's a combination of the two. And, you know, many people will sit somewhere in between those two extremes. But for the sort of necessity of medicine, we like to classify things in this way. And actually, we found some quite marked differences between the groups when we were looking at how they wanted to interact with user interfaces and things like that. So, as I said, we've been doing some work with LION+MASON over the last, and thank you to them for inviting us, to apply person-centered design thinking to our ADHD product as a sort of use case for our wider design process. So for this, we interviewed 22 patients split across the 3 groups that I was talking about. There's a real focus on people-centered design. And then we took the information from those interviews, sort of assimilated it, and then held our own ideation sessions run by LION+MASON to develop new ideas. And this was it was a really enlightening process for me, and it's kind of changed the way that we work on our design, because it involved all of our team, going through the different steps and thinking about new features and ways that we can develop the overall design itself. But it also made me much more aware of the fact that as a doctor, I'm very cautious. So when we get through to the part of the ideation session where we're looking at the risks and we're marking them in black, and I have 10 of them and everyone else has none or one, it does make you very aware of the way that you can impact sort of the design process, and why it then becomes important to give everyone a voice and to try to bring those things in perhaps a little bit later once the ideas have had a chance to flourish. So these are the areas where I really changed my mind through this particular process. So it's this movement, as I was describing before, from symptoms to lived experiences. My experience as a doctor is very different to the everyday experience of a patient. I might consider myself to be a subject matter expert in the condition we're talking about itself, but that doesn't mean that I understand what it is for you as an individual to go through that every day, and the interactions you have with the people around you, the world around you, your relationships, your work, your family, all of these things. And that becomes much more central to what we're trying to achieve and how we're going to provide support. You know, I've talked about the fact that it's nearly 5 years for some people to get to the point of even reaching diagnosis. And so we want to provide something that's really going to be useful during that whole time. I'm going to talk a little bit on the next slide about moving from gamification to explanation, and this was based on the feedback of some of our users, and also the idea of shame states, and that with particular groups that can have a much stronger impact, a negative impact than you might expect, and what we did about that. So these are some quotes from our users. One person said, when we talked about gamification, they said, "Make it a game, give me wins." They were very enthusiastic about it, and they sort of wanted that. So, and by gamification, I'm sure many of you know what I mean, the idea that we include rewards within the experience itself, that you are essentially on a journey and get feedback in the short and longer term based on your interactions with the treatment or with the app. Someone else, however, said, "Reminders feel like I'm being told off. Standard alarms re-trigger a lifetime of being told you forgot." And similar to this, there's also the idea of traditional gamification elements like streaks and stuff like that were seen as tremendously negative by the people we spoke to. And they said that those kind of incentives, which should be a positive, they would view as a strong negative, because they felt that if they broke the streak, they just didn't want to ever turn on the app again. That's fair enough. And we also got asked, why am I doing this? So we had thought that offering a digital treatment would be sort of people would feel enthused to do so, and if we did it in an appealing way with gamification elements, and that wasn't really the case. People were much more interested in, what is this going to do for me? If I give you 5 minutes or 10 minutes of my time, why should I do that rather than doing something else that I might prefer to do? And so we've sort of incorporated that much more into our design now as well, explaining what the benefits are of specific treatments, how that will impact your, not just your symptoms, but your everyday life, and what kind of tasks will it help with. And this is what I was talking about with shame states. So in our initial design that we put to users, we had a green line, and the idea was that you do a number of tasks which would make up a more complex task, like leaving the house on time. So a planning exercise. And if you went over time, the bar would initially turn yellow, and then it might turn red. And And all of our users hated this. They found it tremendously negative, and they felt that it sort of brought about this sense of shame, this idea that they're being told off, and they don't want that in the interaction. So our user here, they said, that little red bar makes me feel like I failed. Once I see it, my day is kind of over. And we had this with a lot of the elements, because this is a specific group of patients for whom starting, maintaining, and finishing a task can be tremendously challenging. We have to think about things differently, and what might be perceived as a sort of a totally reasonable design decision in another context becomes catastrophically bad for certain patients within this group. So, in summary, combining clinical experience and co-design is something that we are trying to do to lead to more empathetic design choices that reflect support for people's lives rather than just their symptoms. We've also done a lot of work on sort of looking at healthcare pathways, and this has also changed how we think about the design of our products, because when you're designing for the NHS, this has all sorts of implications. It has regulatory implications, timeline implications. Fundamentally, you're getting to an endpoint where you need a NHS body to choose to fund you versus another treatment and provide the evidence for that. Whereas actually a lot of the patients that we spoke to, what they wanted was something that was going to help with their everyday lives, and that in itself was of benefit. And we needed to be more holistic about how we were approaching the whole thing. We also used, as I say, person-centered design systems thinking, and this let us understand that there are different routes for commercialization. So if we're not going down that particular path, it's just the NHS and just looking at symptoms and managing symptoms, it opens up a lot of different possibilities about how we can deliver our treatment. Is it going to be in clinics? Is it going to be at home? Are you going to do it on your mobile? Are you going to use VR? Does it need to be led by a clinician? And a lot of these become much, it gives us a lot more openness in our design and allows us a lot more avenues to explore, which we might previously not have considered. And also collaborative projects lead to great opportunities for skill transfer. So working with LION+MASON has been fantastic. It's really taught us a lot about how we can approach things differently. In all of our projects, we've always done co-design, and we've always worked with patients to get feedback, but the manner in which you do that and the way in which you work with the information afterwards is something that we've really changed in hindsight, particularly through sort of ideation sessions and all of these things to really open up our thinking about what we're going to offer. So, takeaways. Start with their world. So look at the person themselves. What is it they want? What is it they need? Which is often very different to what does the NHS want you to deliver, which is something that we've had to sort of examine with our own processes. Inform rather than gamify. We found that our patients were, in many ways it fits in with what Andy was saying about don't patronize. We had to credit everyone with the intelligence to know themselves and manage their own situation as far as they're able to. And actually, a large part of that is providing the information that they need in order to choose whether to use your treatment, whether to participate or not, or to do something else. And actually, the way that we're doing sort of our onboarding and explaining all of these things, I think is tremendously more valuable for the individual than the sort of gamification things that we were looking at previously. Avoiding shame states, as I've said, really important, particularly in this group of users. And co-design, which can be, as I'm sure you all know, can be really, really difficult. Even in small teams, we have a neurodiverse team, and it does make a big difference to the way that you develop your designs. For example, we have a team member who has ADHD, hyperactive subtype, and the UI that they then put in place was considered totally appropriate by many of our users who also had hyperactive subtype. But for the users who had inattentive subtype ADHD, they found it too cluttered, too busy. They wanted less stuff on screen, and so we wouldn't find that sort of stuff out without this sort of co-design, this validation with users, and this iterative prototyping process. Thank you very much for giving me the time to speak to you today.